Everything you're about to hear is just my assessment. It's my opinion, and not to be taken as fact.
Thorough, blunt, and condemning assessment. Mega Maniacs, November 11th, 2025. Hosted by Robyn Torgrimson. This episode of Mega Maniacs is a sustained, humane, and necessary takedown of what the evidence and lived testimony show to be a morally corrupt pattern at World Harvest Church under Rod Parsley's leadership. I'll be direct. Everything about the handling of Chad's case, the fundraising rhetoric, and the institutional priorities laid out on this show is obscene, spiritually bankrupt, ethically indefensible, and pastorally cruel. Robyn's episode exposes a church machine that markets compassion while systematically withholding it from the people in its own pews. I stand fully with Robyn. She does the only thing a conscientious witness can do when leadership weaponizes faith and money. She names it, documents it, and mobilizes real help to the powerless. Here, I will unpack the episode's strongest charges, the theological and ethical failures they reveal, the psychological mechanics used to sustain them, the financial picture that explains motive, and why the institutional design at World Harvest is unbiblical and dangerous. 1. The human costs. Chad's story is a moral indictment. Chad is not a case study or a sad anecdote. He's the human cost of a ministry that prioritizes brand, broadcast, and donor cultivation over the vulnerable under its roof. He gave decades of life and loyalty to World Harvest, attended Valor, trusted the institution, and then was banned for falling asleep on a couch while exhausted and living in his car. That's not discipline. It's humiliation. It's abandonment. Robyn plays Chad's video in full and then correctly reframes what happened. Someone saw a homeless, exhausted man and escalated. Leadership decided exclusion rather than care. The episode's raw reaction, heartbreak, anger, and the refusal to let this be softened by euphemism is exactly the right moral register. Churches that ban homeless longtime members for resting on a lounge couch while simultaneously running glossy mission campaigns have inverted every biblical standard about the care of the least of these. That inversion isn't an accident, it's the logical product of structural priorities that the episode exposes. 2. The theology invoked is performative and monetized, not pastoral Rod Parsley sermon clip about the tithe. 10% of sanctified gross income is a clear example of theological invention shaped by fundraising calculus rather than scripture historically and biblically. Tithing in Israel was tied to agricultural produce and the Levites' support. The New Testament emphasizes voluntary, cheerful, proportional, spirit-led giving, not a contractual gross paycheck deduction dressed up in sanctified-sounding language. The episode rightly calls out the fabricated language, sanctified gross income, as a taxonomic trick to convert spiritual obligation into regular revenue streams. That kind of linguistic sleight of hand is a hallmark of ministries that have financial priorities masquerading as spiritual mandates. Robyn's deconstruction is sharp and necessary. 3. Financial opacity equals moral corruption. The spreadsheets and donor analyses Robyn shows on the program paint a predictable but sickening picture. Massive fundraising returns, tiny percentages actually spent on the purported mission, food, humanitarian aid, and large sums siphoned into general ministry support, airtime, travel, salaries, luxury lodging. The episode plays internal testimony, Wayne Hasselow's inside observations, describing matching challenges, the performative marketing language, and the accounting gymnastics that make 150,000 meals sent sound heroic, while actual expenditures on food are microscopic. This pattern, raise millions using emotionally compelling campaign language, allocate only a small fraction to the named cause, and keep the rest to sustain brand infrastructure and leadership lifestyles, is not merely bad stewardship, it is exploitation. It commodifies suffering to sell donors a feeling while treating congregants who need help as an inconvenient expense. The spreadsheets Robyn walks through show the math: low per meal costs, pennies per meal at wholesale, massive revenues, and expenses that overwhelmingly benefit the ministry's platform. That asymmetry explains why Chad was ignored. Proximity reveals the truth donors are asked not to see. 4. Institutional loyalty as manipulation. Loyalty equals holiness. One of the most damning dynamics Robyn names, and backs up with testimony and psychology, is the conditioning of members to equate loyalty to leadership with holiness. That's how abuse holds. You reframe obedience to leaders as a spiritual marker. You stigmatize questioning as sin, and you cultivate an internal culture where suffering is explained away as testing or spiritual warfare. In plain terms, that's emotional control. Robyn correctly identifies that slavish loyalty is being taught as virtue within World Harvest's ecosystem. Chad's continuing defense of the ministry, while personally heartbreaking, is an example of that conditioning. Victims and the exploited still defend the very structure that injured them because they have been trained to interpret protection of leadership as an act of faith. This is the pastoral equivalent of cognitive capture. Robyn's blunt labeling of this as Stockholm Syndrome dressed as devotion is not rhetorical excess. It is a warranted clinical metaphor that describes how dynamic control is produced and maintained. 5. Marketing cruelty, humanitarian spectacle versus neighborly care. Robyn pulls apart the rhetorical tactics. Big, proud headlines about meals sent, designed for emotional conversion to giving, matching challenge language that creates artificial urgency, and images of overseas poverty used to make local suffering invisible. This is marketing cruelty. It's far easier to sell a glossy promo reel of a distant mission than to confess to donors that the congregation's elderly or homeless student population needs help, because the latter would require reallocating funds, reducing executive perks, and admitting failure. The episode's point that proximity kills the illusion is critical. If leadership spent on local needs in front of the congregation, they'd have to answer for why millions were raised and little returned to the promised recipients. So the optics are outsourced overseas and the moral obligation is outsourced to donors' guilt. That trading of spectacle for substance is a foundational sin the episode exposes. 6. Donor grooming and predatory appeals. Robyn shows a recent high donor email urging gifts from IRAs, appreciated assets, and donor-advised funds, promising breakthroughs and spiritual favor in return. That email is the modern template for predatory donor cultivation. It targets vulnerable retirees who may be on fixed incomes. It monetizes spiritual promises, and it explicitly positions giving as a transactional route to blessing. This is not benevolent stewardship. It is solicitation dressed as devotion. The logic of such appeals is corrosive. It enshrines a theology of reward for purchase, where spiritual fruit is fungible with financial transfer. Biblical Christianity has always warned against such crude mercantilism. See the fruitless barn building of the rich fool in Luke 12. Robyn's righteous outrage at asking elderly donors to liquidate retirement assets for television ministry is morally justified and scripturally sound. 7. Scriptural indictment, the gap between claim and practice. Robyn reads Isaiah 58 and Luke 12, passages that condemn indifferent religiosity and hoarded wealth. And for good reason, the leadership language, public crusades, promise-laden fundraising, and brand-first stewardship is at odds with Scripture's insistence that real religion is to loose the chains of injustice and to share your food with the hungry. Isaiah 58. That theological gap is not a minor hermeneutical disagreement, it's a radical inversion. The ministry presents an image of godliness while practicing systems that reward wealth and ignore immediate need. Again, the episode's moral and scriptural framing is correct. The scandal is not only financial, it is theological. The show strips away the euphemisms and shows the naked mismatch. Piety as a marketing tool, not as a sacrificial ethic towards neighbors. 8. Payroll, perks, and platform maintenance, where the money goes. Robyn plays spreadsheets that show high travel costs, airtime expenses, and line items that resemble executive lifestyle spending, luxury hotels, private jet logistics, road income, etc. Those line items explain the ministry's urgent need to keep fundraising relentless. The platform is expensive, and the mechanisms used to keep it funded are manipulative. It's not inherently sinful for a ministry to have costs. Broadcasting, staff, and mission logistics all require resources. The sin is the disproportionate allocation and the secrecy, raising enormous sums under humanitarian labels while paying lavishly for platform and leadership. The episode's evidence suggests ministry budgets prioritize brand maintenance over neighborly care. That priority is a moral failure. 9. Abuse of process and privilege. Banning the vulnerable. The act of banning a vulnerable longtime member for nonviolent behavior, resting while exhausted. Then expecting him to finish school online without offering basic pastoral care or benevolent support is an abuse of ecclesial power. Churches are supposed to be sanctuaries. Administrators who weaponize policy to exclude instead of care are betraying every trust Christians place in pastoral authority. Robyn is right to call this moral bankruptcy. The episode demonstrates how institutional procedures can be used as instruments of exclusion rather than instruments of restoration. That moral reversal is precisely what pastoral oversight must guard against. And when it fails, public exposure is a responsible corrective. 10. What good accountability looks like and how World Harvest fails. Robyn models constructive accountability in this episode. She documents, shows spreadsheets, names practices, offers scripture, and then mobilizes direct help for needy people. Not for show, but in small, confidential, verifiable ways. That's the exact opposite of the brand spectacle. Accountability should do 3 things. 1. Make public what is hidden. Financials, donor appeals, and outcomes must be transparent. 2. Prioritize those in the pews. Benevolence should be immediate, non-shaming, and not conditional on fundraising targets. 3. Reform incentive structures. Leadership compensation, travel budgets, and marketing must be aligned with mission outcomes, not platform growth. World Harvest, as described in the episode and its materials, fails on all 3 counts. Robyn shows that failure, and crucially, provides an alternative. Direct, confidential help for individuals like Chad. No cameras, just mercy. That is what ecclesial integrity looks like in practice. Final verdict. Blunt summary. Rod Parsley and the institutional machinery described in this episode are guilty, morally and theologically, of substituting brand for charity, spectacle for substance, and marketing for mercy. The evidence Robyn presents, the sermon clips, the donor emails, the internal accounting patterns, and Chad's heartbreaking testimony all point to a ministry that monetizes generosity while metabolizing the local poor into silent evidence of loyalty. That's not ministry. That's predation dressed in sanctified language. Robyn Torgrimson did exactly what a responsible Christian should do. She listened to an abused parishioner, used evidence and testimony to expose systemic wrongdoing, and redirected energy toward real compassion rather than performative campaigns. Her action is pastoral, prophetic, and urgently needed. I condemn, strongly and without qualification, the behaviors, policies, and theological rationalizations that permit this kind of cruelty to persist under the cover of ministry. If a church will throw one of its own into the street rather than hold a meeting to figure out how to help him, then every donor, every elder, and every follower of that brand owes the moral duty to demand accountability, transparency, and restitution. Robyn is right to be furious. She is right to be compassionate. She is right to act. And anyone who still values the gospel should stand with her until the church's priorities are reordered to match the heart of Christ, care for the least, sacrificial stewardship, and truth without gilded excuses.